Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And we are thrilled to have you today on this very important topic and very timely intervention. I join my co-founder, Emma Essien Laurie, to welcome you once again to another webinar being organized by Wealth for Impact. And for those who don't know or who are joining us for the first time, Wealth for Impact is an organization that we co-founded about 2 years ago with the primary focus of helping African families and diaspora families, people of color who either have businesses or family enterprises to consider how to steward these enterprises and their emerging wealth to ensure generational wealth and generational impact. We started this because of recognition that many of us and many of you on this call are, starting to amass some amount of wealth because of your success in business or in your professional pursuits. And you also have a desire to give back. And you're being called on to give back in many, many ways. Oftentimes, you get that phone call for that health emergency or the school fees. Your relative somewhere, someplace needs help, and you send that check. But many of you, like we do, recognize that sometimes bandage solutions are not really long-term, and sadly, when you give a little, more is expected. It never stops. And so the challenge for us, especially as many of our economies are going through a difficult time right now, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and the list goes on, is the recognition that we have to start thinking about generational wealth and generational impact, and that the good work we've started must outlive us. We've been fortunate in this team to have a webinars over the last 2 years focused on diverse topics. One was really focused on succession and how you ensure generational wealth transfer and generational impact transfer. Another one was really focused on family foundations and how people have structured their giving. We've had sessions where we've discussed the challenges around building generational impacts in Africa. And this one is really focused on diaspora, and it's exciting because with the Japa syndrome that we have in Nigeria, many of our best and brightest leaving the shores of the land, we often wonder, is this a loss or a gain? And as the Indian populations have shown us and the Jewish populations have shown us, sometimes it can be a gain, and it should be a gain. And so today we're going to be talking about that. How can we ensure that the diaspora populations rise up and really make a difference that is strategic, long-term, and transformational? And I'm delighted to welcome an esteemed panel with us today. We have Dr. Aham Onyike, who is an old friend of mine and a very well-respected orthopedic surgeon who, through his personal pursuits and in partnership with many other Nigerian doctors, has led transformative work in Nigeria. And we're so excited that he's joined us today. Jean Adero is also a phenomenal woman. I don't know her personally, but I've heard of her great work in a range of contexts, especially around reading and promoting the culture of reading and transferring a lot of the good work she's been doing, not only in Kenya, but across the world. So we're going to be hearing about her. And then Josh Yam, who is part of an amazing network and actually chairs this amazing network of Africans in diaspora who are thinking strategically about how to invest and how to engage. Our fourth speaker, my sister, my biological sister, in our context, we call people my sister, but this one is actually my biological sister who I'm extremely proud of, Professor Una Osili, who has conducted pioneering research on remittances and giving as part of her PhD over 30 years ago, but now has been continue to do work on immigrant populations and philanthropy, and leading a lot of work philanthropy in the US through her role at the Lilly School of Philanthropy, her work across the world shaping policies around philanthropy, her work on giving pledges and data. But unfortunately, she just had a personal family emergency and will be joining us hopefully before the end of the session. I've also encouraged her that if one of her colleagues can join the Lilly School, she should notify us. But it's quite unfortunate. But she just had a very, very serious family emergency. And so we will pray for the family at this difficult time. And so I'm delighted to pass the baton to my co-founder and my sister, not biological but spiritual, Emma and Laurie. And for those of you who don't know Emma, Emma is a powerhouse and wears many, many hats. And I met Emma over, I don't know, 25 years ago, when we were both getting our MBAs. I was at Harvard, Emma was at Wharton, and we conceived the idea of the Africa Business Conference together. And the amazing thing was that the theme for the Harvard Africa Business Conference was reversing the brain drain. And this was the seminal first conference, and it's gone on to become an extremely successful convening at Harvard. And since then, we've worked together and done life together in many, many countries and contexts. And Emma is based in Nairobi. I'm based in Lagos. And she's also an expert on governance, ESG, and most recently was the head of the IFC in Lagos, Nigeria. So I'll pass on to Emma, but welcome again. We're so delighted that all of you have joined us today. Please put in the chat where you're joining us from, what part of the world you're joining us from today, and what your hopes and aspirations are for this session as we kick off. So I'm passing it on to Emma.
Thank you, Ndidi. I don't think she introduced herself. So those of you, Ndidi Nunelli, those of you who know her, know that she in her own likeness is a powerhouse, has inspired many people to set up their own social enterprises. She herself is a serial social entrepreneur. I think she will, Ndidi, probably have 10 more enterprises in you, I'm sure. And Wealth for Impact was her brainchild. And as she said, we are extremely passionate about the opportunity that we see for African philanthropy, and not the way we typically think about it. Most of us, when we think about philanthropy, we think about the uber rich, the uber high net worth individuals. But we believe that effective and sustainable philanthropy can happen really at this middle level, successful professionals, whether they are living in Africa or living in the diaspora. Most of us have kind of inbuilt in us this desire to give back. We don't know where it came from, but it's been inbuilt. And so many of us are already giving back in one form or another. And so we believe that this actually can be a very significant engine of growth. Hopefully, if Una is able to join, but even if she isn't, we'll talk a little bit about some of the trends around this. But most of the development institutions out there are very clear that remittances continue to be a very important part of the development story in Africa. It's true for all continents, but very much so for Africa. And so many development institutions, as they're thinking about the development planning, remittances are a part of that. But as I think we all know, when we think about remittances, oftentimes it's short term. I think the African Development Bank uses this term consumption smoothing, right? So we're helping family members who are experiencing many crises, temporary crises, but things that are necessary. And many of us can help, and we do help. But ultimately, we know deep down that there's going to be another crisis around the corner. And so we know that this is, we can continue to give this in this way, but ultimately it's not really moving the needle in the way in which we desire. And so we think that we can do something about this. We think that we can encourage hundreds and hundreds of family businesses, professionals, again, in Africa and across the diaspora, to really start to formalize their giving, that they themselves are philanthropists. We are philanthropists. You don't have to be uber wealthy to be a philanthropist. In fact, I think the term philanthropy was coined, and I think in the 5th century by a Greek philosopher, and it means love of humanity, right? So really, philanthropy can show up in many different ways. We talk about giving your time, your talent, and your treasure, right? And it can come in so many different forms. So we really want to kind of move this agenda forward and really help and encourage people to take the next step on their journey. the next step on the journey. I'll say something about my own personal journey. My family recently set up a family philanthropy. My both of my parents are late. My mother passed away a couple of years ago, and my parents were just big givers. I grew up in the U.S. and it occurred to us that we needed to formalize what my parents were doing, and it's taken a while to actually go through this process. But that's exactly what we think many families have the heart for over time, and ultimately it will make a difference. So hopefully more and more people will do this. So we again have this incredible panel. We have a really good discussion. What we hope as the objective of this conversation is that many of you will feel encouraged to make the next step on your journey, wherever you are in the spectrum of giving, but take that next step of just formalizing a bit more. Or maybe for you, it's asking for feedback on impact, or wherever you are in your journey, but just take that next step so that ultimately your giving does become much more sustainable. That's our hope. And this panel will hopefully inspire you to make some of those steps. So let's start the discussion with Jean. So I'm based in Nairobi, and Jean is Kenyan. And Jean is an amazing human being. I want to say a little bit about her. Um, she calls herself the Africa's life coach. Somebody else has called you Africa's version of Oprah. So I think you can take that. If I were you, I would take that. Jean she's unique in that she really has the opportunity to influence many diasporans because she is a coach, and she starts her coaching journey with her clients, really thinking about transformation, and that starts with the inward journey. So I'm going to let her talk a little bit about how she sees Africa in the context of her coaching. But she founded an organization called Reimagine Africa, and that is where she does her coaching. And after doing 2 decades of corporate work, many of us have gone through this journey. We've done the corporate work. She found her real passion and is really leading the charge and helping many scores and scores and scores and scores of primarily women, African women, women of African descent, to really push the envelope on their personal transformation. And all of them have a heart for giving, and that's the unique thing. They all have a heart for giving, and so she'll tell us more about that. And then her own philanthropy, her own not-for-profit that she started in Kenya. Dr. Aham, welcome. He has a surgery in a couple of hours, so he's really giving some great moments of your time. So we really appreciate it. For you, it's very interesting is that, when I look at your bio, I think this must be two people. It can't be just one person, right? So you are an orthopedic surgeon. You have a practice in the Washington, D.C., Virginia, Maryland area, as well as in Lagos and Owerri. So how you do that, well, you'll have to explain how you manage that. You founded your organization, Avante Orthopedics, and also co-founded this organization, Advanced Specialty Surgery, with branches in Nigeria. And you're a chief executive there. Again, how you manage to do that with one person is pretty amazing. And then in addition to that, you have other organizations that you have co-founded and spent time with, including this organization called Operation Stand, Walk, Run. So we're going to be very interested to hear about how you manage to balance what seems like quite a bit, but also really stay inspired about your journey for giving. Josh, welcome. Josh is calling in from Hanoi. He just landed. So thank you. That's about 20 hours of flight time, so that's real commitment. Josh is the founder and the managing partner of Ignite Venture Studios, and they are an innovation accelerator focused on the health and beauty sectors. And he does a lot of work with women and minority startups in the U.S. Prior to this role, he was the CTO, the Chief Technology Officer at Johnson & Johnson Consumer Health. Now, again, as Aditi said, he's the chair of the African Diaspora Network. And so he's got his feet on the ground and ear to the ground around what diasporans are thinking about specifically with respect to investing and how to really magnify those philanthropic dollars and really make them go to the next level. So we'll be really interested to hear your journey, Josh. So let's start with your personal journey. So I've said a little bit about all of you, but ultimately, giving is a very personal thing. We all are motivated by personal reasons. So I'd love if you all share a little bit about your own personal journey, your milestones, your pitfalls around why you are where you are today in terms of how you think about giving in Africa, how you think about philanthropy in Africa. What are the things that have really motivated you to stay the course? And what have you learned from some of those things? Aham, why don't we start with you?
I'll start off by saying good afternoon and good evening to those of you on the other side of the pond. It is a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation and the opportunity, and for the kind introduction, which captured my current status as an orthopedic surgeon and businessman practicing in 2 continents. And that's been my entire life. I've had a presence in 2 continents, definitely early childhood in both continents, and now my professional life has also been the case. I think a lot of things with many of us come from our parents. And I would say that for me, in my early childhood, my parents, my dad in particular, had some exposure to the Pan-African movement and the civil rights movement in his era. And very often conversations were in that direction, books, magazines, other material was there. And I think it probably at some point planted a seed in me that gave me this bird's eye view, I'll call it that, of a disparity in our continent and the need for us in our lifetime to catch up. And so as I finished secondary school and came to the United States to practice, there was always this mentality, I'll call it that, to somehow or the other connect the growing talents and exposures, opportunity, and wealth, if I would acquire that, to apply it to the needs in Nigeria and participate in my own way. And so as I finished my residency and became a practicing orthopedic surgeon, I immediately looked for ways to do that. And it began by going to the country, different parts of the country, and doing what we call medical missions, treating one patient at a time, doing complex surgeries that help one patient or one family. In many cases, go from not being able to walk to being able to do so, not being able to earn income to being able to do so. But it became very clear that that was just a small drop in the bucket and not quite sufficient enough. And as I reflected on what I could do and the needs that were so vast and daunting, it became obvious that it needed to be more of a communal effort, a network of like-minded people. And that evolved to setting up a hospital. I'll be brief. Setting up a hospital that then had a second branch. And with that hospital, we immediately saw a need to teach and train and have a sustainable method of delivering care so that it was not dependent on me coming there, intermittently, but it could be sustainable by having, Nigerians on the ground learn and acquire the skills. So essentially, rather than giving fish, teaching people to fish. And to support this effort, we established a nonprofit organization called Operation Stanwalk Run to train, equip, and provide humanitarian care in that method. We also became aware of the political challenges and the limitants.
Second floor, room 201.
Sorry about that.
About the second floor, room 201.
Did not expect that. But the need for some level of political involvement. And so we've set up an organization called Organization for Impact and Reform to train young organizers to get involved in the political space. And then most recently, I'm very excited, and I think we'll have an opportunity to talk about it some more, about an organization called BIND, which is the Business Integrated Network Diaspora Associates, that's emerging and is very exciting to me. It's a network of Native African origin, multi-million-dollar business people who are combining efforts to have impact and grow wealth on both sides of the continent. And I look forward to talking about that some more. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Let me pass it over to Jean. Tell us a little bit about your own journey, Jean.
Yes, thank you. I really am appreciative of this opportunity. Number one, it is always a good time to talk about philanthropy. It's always a good time to talk about giving. But to start my journey, I would have to say that cultural shackles have gotten me to a point where I woke up. And when I say that, I mean, in 1998, my father passed away, and we're a family of 6 girls. And when he died, his siblings thought it would be a wise idea to disinherit the girls. And this is a story that is common across anywhere Africa, okay? And I can't say that that ancestral home was very important to me at the time it was happening, because I was a city girl. And I was the city girl who was mired by the impact of colonialism. So growing up in Nairobi, I thought about leaving Kenya and going to the world, which was supposed to be better than Kenya, right? And when you think about a girl like that, I'm not thinking about my ancestral home. I'm not thinking about all the things I saw my grandmother doing to give other people. I wasn't thinking about what my dad did to educate others. That wasn't my focus. But sometimes you have to leave home to find home. And when I left Kenya to move to the United States, I started naturally realizing that I always had a gem. And so going back to when this happened in 1998, I was drawn by the idea that my father, who went to the University of Nebraska in 1966, and my mother, who worked for the United Nations for since maybe 21 years or 22 years, were mired in probably what is the biggest problem in rural Kenya. And I thought to myself, how can it be that educated people have this kind of problem, yet they are the ones who should be spearheading what the gender inequities are causing across the continent? And in that moment, I remember thinking, my father has a house built in his ancestral land, just like many other Africans. It is vacant. It is infected with bats. And I think someone said a million bats because there were so many. And I thought to myself, if girls are not allowed to stay in this village and live in this village like men would, how do we solidify our roots and plant them here so nobody can ever tell me that I do not belong here where my ancestors came from? We turned our home into a library. I got 22,000 books shipped from Atlanta, Georgia, into Kisumu. And of course, we are from the shores of Lake Victoria. I found local teachers, librarians. There were young people who had actually studied library science. I'm still trying to figure out why, considering the number of libraries in Kenya are slim to none. And now I realize that God had them planned for me. And then I knew we had rural kids. Kids in the rural areas are hungry. But everybody said to me that we do not have a reading culture. And I said, what does that even mean? If you do not have books, you do not have reading culture. There is no way you can read something that you do not have. And that was 2015. 10 years later, I can tell you that we have 15 kids going in the university. And these are kids who've earned their way. I did not even make it into the universities, they did. They grow up with in rural areas with no running water, no electricity, and yet they have been able to do this. So my question is, what happens when we bring children from preschool into high school, into primary school, into high school, and onto the university? What happens when they transform their own communities? That is the basis of my life. And yes, I call myself Africa's life coach. I gave myself that name. And you know how I did it? I heard that Muhammad Ali called himself the greatest before he was the greatest. And so I thought, if I call myself Africa's life coach, then I'll become that. So people now call me Africa's life coach. And MA, thank you for calling me Africa's life coach, because I love it. I absolutely love it. And my message to African people is call yourself whoever you want to be, and then start transforming your rural community. I was a C student, B student on a good day. And sometimes I got some D's, E's, and there were no F's, thank God, because I would have got those. But my point here is to say, you choose who you want to be, and it is your responsibility, daughter, son of Africa, to transform that continent with what you have. And Wangari Maathai, who is my hero in philanthropy, and she said, my little thing is planting trees. Growing up, I never thought that I would wake up one morning lying in my bed watching the Today Show in Atlanta and hear the name of the daughter of an African man and woman announced as the Nobel Peace Prize winner. I cannot believe, I remember thinking, oh my God, this is the Today Show. And in Kenya, she was maligned for the work that she was doing. And she became that. She said, my little thing is planting trees. My little thing is literacy and leadership for Africa. And that's why Read Across Africa is in front of me and the best thing that I've ever done in my life. It gave me a career. Read Across Africa gave me a career because I was struggling in corporate America, trying to fit into the boxes. And then one young man named Alan, who grew up in rural Kisumu, Karating, scored the highest points that we had seen in that village. And I realized that nobody had a plan for him. Nobody's thinking about rural Africa in the way that we should be. We are kind of, sort of, but not really going into it and saying, what do we do to uplift a lot of people at a go? And when he got that high score and he was invited to spaces that very few people had been invited to in the few years prior to that, I recognized that it was time for me to open my mouth and speak to leaders. When I spoke to leaders, I found out that most leaders have a vision for their husband, their wife, their children, and their picket fence and their dog. But very few people are really thinking about rural kids in rural areas in Africa. And that's how I became a life coach. If it wasn't for Alan, it would not have happened, right? I meet leaders, I meet professionals who have so much potential and just haven't given themselves the time. And to me, I see there's almost 100 people on this Zoom. And I say, what is your little thing? Oh, average person, what is your little thing?
Yeah.
Oh, leader, what is your little thing?
Yeah, I think that'll be our calling card there. What is your little thing, right? And also, having to leave home to find home. Thank you, Jean. Josh, let's move over to you. Tell us a little bit about your journey, how and you're in Hanoi now, not necessarily how you found yourself there, but the work that you're doing with the African Diaspora Network. What are you seeing, and what's your journey to actually working with that organization, and what are you gonna do to take them to the next level?
Yeah, no, first of all, thank you for having me. Yes, I am in Hanoi. Just landed a little over an hour ago, actually, from New York. But normally I'm based in Princeton, New Jersey, in the US. Originally from Eritrea. I actually was born and grew up in Eritrea, finished high school in Sudan, and then my parents decided to move to the US, and I'll explain why, in a sense, what they did. So my mom worked for the Swiss Red Cross. So if you recall the famine in Ethiopia, a lot of refugees went to Sudan. So she moved to Sudan to actually work with the Red Cross. And my dad was a teacher, but during that time, he also decided that he's going to work with charities to open schools across wherever the refugee camps are. So my dad used to run the refugee camps across Sudan with a lot of Eritreans and Ethiopians at that time. And then open schools to what Jean was talking about, which is how do you actually make sure that these refugees, these children, when they're coming, they didn't choose to come, their parents brought them for different reasons, but how do you make sure that they're not left out? So so that's how we got started into a lot of it. We lived in Sudan for a very long time. I actually went my whole high school in Sudan. And it's interesting because there's some misconceptions. So my education, for example, I went full high school in Sudan. When we moved to US, I went straight to college, no issues in terms of it tells you how much the education level in Africa is actually more valuable if it is made available to a lot more people, to Jean's point, especially kids that don't live in the cities. So decided to move to the US. Again, it was more from my parents because they were traveling nonstop. So a lot of times we were just sitting at home, going to school while they did work in different refugee camps. Moved to the US. I did my undergraduate and my PhD at University of Illinois, actually Indiana University and then University of Illinois. I'm a biochemist by training. And right after that, actually got recruited by Colgate-Palmolive to work in New Jersey and then moved to Europe for a little while and then left that to go to Pfizer. I worked with Pfizer Consumer Health, which then got acquired by J&J, so Johnson & Johnson. So I spent the last 13 years as the Chief Technology Officer at Johnson & Johnson. And the reason I'm mentioning this is, yes, I think from a career perspective, it was important achievement overall in terms of what I wanted to do. But to give you an example, when I was the Chief Technology Officer at J&J, 4 of the top 10 people in that business, this is like a $15–16 billion business, were Africans. And it shows there was a person from Mozambique, the head attorney was from Nigeria, the head, myself from Eritrea. So when you look at that, you would go, yeah, we have resources. We have people that are capable in different places. And it's interesting because the lens we're judged is not, this is Eritrean, this is all just African. I think that's very important because there's a lot of lessons learned that could be taken from one country to another. And I think that becomes very important. So while I was at J&J, it was very interesting, actually. One of my mentors who happened to be, he was the chief science officer at J&J. He's actually Belgian, and he was one of the first researchers on HIV, finding the first drugs in HIV. He actually moved to Africa to do his research in Congo, and he did a lot of his research there, came back, started a company that actually ended up developing one of the HIV cocktail drugs. And so he was always, everything was about Africa. And there's not a single president or health minister in Africa that doesn't call him when there is an issue somewhere in Africa to just get advice. And I was talking to him and he said, you know, there's a new program that's starting across Africa, which is the Next Einstein Forum. I don't know if anybody is familiar with it. It actually kicked off. And the idea is that the next best mathematician, the next space scientist could actually be in Africa. And how do we actually provide a platform that allows them to showcase what they do? And it was very surprising because it kicked off in Senegal. And I went to attend this and I was actually asked to judge entrepreneurs presenting their ideas. And I was a judge in that. And the more I looked at it, and again, at that time I was representing J&J, the more I look at it and I said, wait, why can't we scale this? Why do it's only 10 entrepreneurs that are presenting? I'm sure if you take all 54 countries, there's probably thousands of them that have different ideas to solve, in some cases, healthcare issues of their community. So I went back, and the fact that we had a lot of Africans at J&J helped quite a bit to say, we're going to launch a new program called the Africa Innovation Challenge related to healthcare. And we're just going to ask any entrepreneur across Africa that have an idea about healthcare, come tell us about it. And the top ones are actually going to get $50,000 to $100,000 to get their idea. But more importantly, I know a lot of times people focus on cash, like how much cash you need, the mentoring piece. You're going to get a supply chain, a healthcare, a regulatory. We're going to give you access to government affairs, all of that to be able to do it. And I think that's what started for me, that journey of, instead of just focusing around what my parents were doing in Eritrea and related stuff, to say we could do this across Africa. So we launched the Africa Innovation Challenge. It's still ongoing. But to give you an example, at that time, one of the first companies we identified was a 24-year-old in Liberia that used to take farm waste materials and turn the ingredients basically into gas for petroleum, basically heating, cooling system, but also he was creating soaps and other stuff on the leftover ingredients. And it was just incredible because the mentoring he got, the cash that we put in the bank for him to be able to just, it's almost, and this is going to be very important because at the African Diaspora Network, we say Africa is not looking for charity. we're looking for sustainable solutions that allows people to thrive on their own with the right mentorship behind them. So it's more like just teaching people how do you manage your financials? How do I create a successful supply chain? And one of the things that he did, which was just incredible, was, I think Jean touched it a little bit. We actually thought that the best way to build this business was to hire women that normally can't work because they're waiting for their kids are going to school, so they can't just leave and go from 8 to 5 or whatever. So we said, what if we hired women like from 10 o'clock to 3 o'clock when their kids are in school, they can go work. Within a year, he had about 300 women working for him. It's just a very simple model. It's a win-win situation than just thinking about traditional way. You have to work 8 to 5, but if you have to take your kids to school, those kinds of things just don't allow women to do those kinds of activities. But having that flexibility to work at the time that works for each one of the women was able to do this, and I think that was great. And as we were doing the Africa Innovation Challenge, basically, I came across Almaz Negash, who's the founder of the African Diaspora Network. I had sent a couple of people on a meeting that she was hosting, and she's Eritrean also. So somebody told her, it's like, there's an Eritrean at J&J that's doing this Africa Innovation Challenge. So she called me and said, we have this African Diaspora Network. It's a very large network. It operates mostly in the Silicon Valley. By the way, Almaz is now on President Biden's Advisory Council on African Diaspora Engagement. And we have quite a few people from the African diaspora that are now advising President Biden on his strategy for Africa, basically, and how to use the African diaspora to invest more into Africa. And I think this is very important because there's a program at the State Department called Prosper Africa. And the idea here is basically, we tend to focus a lot to try to help people in terms of finding the right investment. And obviously, a right investment is always a challenge for Africa. It's easy to send money to your family because you know where it's going. But it's hard to just say, I'm going to put a few $1 million into this business, and you're not sure who those people are. And what we're doing with people like Prosper Africa is that, what if organizations within the US department, other big corporations are actually helping you de-risk some of your financials? They're actually partnering with you, so that for every dollar you put in, they might be putting in some, or they're securing your investment to be able to use some of that money into in Africa. So the African Diaspora Network, I became a chair about 3 years ago. It's a very large network. I think there's about 10,000 or so members, and it's growing every single day. There's more and more. Actually, next week is our 9th meeting, which is the Africa Diaspora Investment Symposium, where people from across Africa, across the world, show up in Silicon Valley to discuss investment opportunities, mainly in healthcare, in education, in finance, and agriculture. Those are the 4 areas that are important. But the most important thing that we think of when we think about philanthropy is not just the cash, but the human capital, the human power, the knowledge that could be transferred and be supportive. So to give you an example, we just recently, with the help of Gates Foundation, we're running a pilot on telehealth in Rwanda. The idea is that the physicians are not going to be in some remote area. But if they're in Kigali, why can't you set up a remote telehealth system where we put a couple of devices that do a lot of diagnostics remotely, and that data goes to the physician that's sitting in a city? By the way, that physician could be sitting in the US. And we're looking to empower a lot of our healthcare professionals that are in the continent, outside the continent, regardless of where they're in the world, to be able to connect through telehealth. And we're doing a pilot with a startup in Rwanda right now. But the idea is that to scale it in Kenya and a few other places after that, I think becomes very important. So I think you're going to see more, and we could talk more about that later.
And thank you so much, Josh. And Aham, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you very much for that. I think it's so important for us to talk through kind of what's motivating us to stay on this path. And you mentioned, Josh, something about sort of it not being charity, right? It's really an investment in the future. And then philanthropy is kind of in this space where it's not just charity, it's more than that. It does. And, our objective really here is to get people to be thinking about sustainable philanthropy, which does involve potential investment as well. So it really does combine all of it. But it is, I think, as you all said, there's a journey, right? So we are moving, you know, you take the next step, right? You take the next step and you learn from that, and then you take the next step. I have more questions for you guys, but I believe that Una has has Una joined? I think so. Well, we'll keep going until she connects, but I think she's going to be able to join and share some of the findings from some of the research that she and her team have done on global philanthropy, because it's quite relevant. But while we wait for her to join, I wanted to now ask you, and whoever wants to take this, you know, please do. There's a big conversation out there around. I mean, first of all, we all know that, you know, philanthropy sometimes gets a bad rap, right? Sometimes it's viewed as being secretive. There's not enough disclosure, and so sometimes people view it quite negatively. How would you, you know, from your perspective, how can we get to a point where there's much more collaboration? So, Josh, you've spoken about that in terms of the ADN, the network. So that very much sounds like kind of the foundation of that is collaboration. But Ahmed and Jean, you have your own initiatives that you're working on, and you're very passionate, and they come from the heart. But talk about, you know, what does collaboration mean to you? And do you think that there are ways for you to collaborate and actually have more impact? And what might you have to give up in the process of making that happen?
I oh, go ahead. I was going to let you start.
You started. Go ahead, and I'll come after
Okay,
you.
right. Well, collaboration is it's challenging because I think when Josh talked about de-risking, it really hit home for me, because that is the number one reason why I had my hands on and I wouldn't let off the reins, because I'm afraid something is going to happen to the investment that I have put into this project, right? But when you start to release some of that, it's really an issue of trust. If I was given an opportunity to lead in corporate America, what is the difference between me and this person who is working for me and has a heart for it, for the project at their level? So it just means that I have to look at you as an individual with goals and dreams. The person who you hire, we're hiring the best in the areas that we are working in. So give the people an opportunity to be seen as a human being first, as a person who has goals and desires, who's willing to grow something from the ground up, and then retire from the idea that you are the queen or the king of the village and actually decide to collaborate. That's literally, it truly is a mindset, and looking at people differently so that they can all build at their level. And then whatever that structure is that you have created will literally become strong in all the areas.
Okay, thanks for that. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, yeah. So there's a very, very deep place that this comes from, and to me, it is that we, as human beings, have the talent, the potential, the capability amongst all of us as Africans. However, we're operating in a system that somehow is structured to deny us that. And so if one were to try and disrupt that, then it's very difficult as an individual to do so. And I think we can now say that in any village, in any local government, in any state, country, there are individuals who have so much talent but don't have the opportunity to express it. And those of us who are vested in those communities can then try to see how that can be unlocked and allow human beings like the rest of us to prosper. I think also that the inability of our communities to prosper indirectly affects us. Part of the reason that the Jewish people get respect wherever they go is because Israel as a country is thriving. Part of the reason that China is starting to get respect is because China as a country is thriving. And so Africans, to some extent, will remain somewhat second fiddle if the continent doesn't overcome some of the deficits that it has. And when one looks at it that way, it becomes a very daunting, massive undertaking that is impossible to do on an individual basis. There are many other people who think the same way, who want to tap into something that they see as a potential pathway for them to make a transformative impact. And by setting the framework to do so, then it becomes more attractive to others. And so that's everything we've done is with that in mind. Our hospitals attract other diaspora surgeons who on their own may not come, but come knowing that they bring their skills and they can perform a complex spine surgery. They can teach local surgeons how to do the surgery and not come back again because now the skills are transferred. They can teach therapists, they can put a system in place that introduces some of the best practice standards for the US in terms of safety. Josh talked about technology with telehealth and on and on. And so when you talk about collaboration, for me, that's absolutely necessary in all fronts. And the one-on-one charity front, just trying to teach skills or to give money, it's more massive when we are able to aggregate it together, or to transfer skills in terms of teaching specialized skills like nursing and therapy and surgery, or in terms of creating businesses. Just talked about Prosper Africa, which we're aware of, and part of that in different ways of creating a framework that allows startup businesses to have a chance, or investors looking for the right startups to connect with. So I think there's an obligation that for me comes from Nelson Mandela, that it's difficult to be aware of a problem, have the ability to fix the problem, and choose to do nothing. And with that in mind, we can look at our continent and see problems. And then the issues, how do we link with others? How do we network with others to take on these problems? And again, on all fronts, individual and on a more massive scale, in business and politics.
Yeah, thank you for that, and also the acknowledgement that it is daunting, but it needs to be done anyway. So thank you for that. Una has joined. So Una, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. I know it's asking quite a bit, so we are really appreciative of your time. I have your presentation that I'm going to put on the screen. Ndidi already introduced you, so
wonderful.
let me figure out how to just give me a second to do this. This technology sometimes is a challenge. And hopefully you can see that screen. And you can
Yes, wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, I think just putting it in presentation mode, and thank you so much for convening this great conversation. I'm going to just try to give a very high level overview of the work that we've been conducting over the past few years, focused on measuring global cross-border exchanges. But this topic on the African diaspora is near and dear to my heart. I feel like I've been thinking about this topic pretty much my whole life. So let's get started very quickly. The next slide, I'm just going to quickly define the African diaspora. We've been having all these conversations, but having some clear definitions is important. And then unpacking all the different ways that the African diaspora is contributing. We heard a lot already from the speakers, but try to put some frameworks around it. And what are the recommendations that come from all the different ways that diaspora communities are currently investing, trading, transferring knowledge, as we heard from Dr. Nuke, but also building communities that transcend borders. So on the very next slide, I'd like to start by just this question of the African diaspora. What is that? On the next slide, we can move to the next one. See, this is a question that I think is very intriguing, the question of who constitutes the African diaspora. When we look at the literature, this term, African diaspora, has been around for quite some time. The 1950s is when we first see it in the academic literature. And more generally, a diaspora refers to dispersion of people once concentrated in one place in many different communities. We talk about the African diaspora, there are two distinct waves that are often brought into the conversation. Certainly the more modern migration of Africans to Europe, to North America, and all over the continent, but also as far-flung as Asia and Australia and so forth. But we can also broaden that definition to include involuntary movement of Africans in modern periods, which gives you quite a large body of people. And in fact, the African Union uses this much broader definition. On the next slide, one of the inspiring components of starting with this definition is it gives you a sense of just how many people we're referring to. If we use the more narrow definition, an older estimate is at least 40 million people. That estimate is based on 2017, live outside of their country of origin. That is a more narrow definition. With the more expansive definition, we have 350 million people as part of the African diaspora. So when we say that our talents are not just remittances and trade, but it's really people, the sheer size makes the African diaspora one of the largest communities in the world, really one of the largest countries that way. And this number alone has, examples. Ghana now provides citizenship to members of the Okay, even here in the United States, I think there's been a mobilization and awareness of population is. On the very next slide, as we move forward, I want
Una, maybe turn off your video because I'm losing you.
Hi, Una, can you hear us?
I just want to, I know we're almost out of time, but just to say that the main implications here, the African diaspora contributions, we've heard a lot about remittances, we've heard a lot about the philanthropy, but I also want to emphasize that we have significant untapped trade and investment benefits, as well as a lot of potential around innovation, collaboration, which you've heard about, and the need to really network. If there was a question that I feel like we can solve today is how do we start to build the networks so that the individuals in the diaspora can connect with those back in their home countries or region of origin to start to unlock the development potential that lies within the African diaspora. So I'll just share one slide on the numbers and then I'll turn it back over to Emma because I know we have to conclude. So I hope that all of you will go and look at the resources on the Global Philanthropy Tracker because it is very intentional that we don't just focus on philanthropic outflows, but we put them in conversation with remittances, official development assistance, and private capital flows to show all the different ways that diaspora communities can contribute. So there's just one slide that I'll share on the very next slide, which measures cross-border flows in 2020, the latest data that we have. And I think all of us can agree that this slide alone should share with us just how important diaspora communities are in Africa, on the African continent, and beyond. So let me just say, when we track cross-border flows by country, for 47 countries, we track $800 billion roughly. Of that, 840 billion, about 10% are philanthropic flows, so traditional foundations, individual donors, as well as corporate donors. Remittances by far outstrip official development assistance, private capital flows, and FDI. In fact, remittances are the big, perhaps, takeaway from all this work on cross-border flows. Within the African continent, taking this home, for Nigeria alone, one of the largest economies on the continent, remittances, both recorded and unrecorded, are set to reach $25 billion. To put this in perspective, this is about 6% of GDP. Remittances exceed foreign direct investment, ODA, and every single other type of flow to Nigeria. This is a surprise to a lot of Africans and Nigerians. But if we look by country within Africa, we get the very same picture that by far the most neglected part of our economy is really our engagement with our diaspora. And during the COVID pandemic, what we saw was not a retrenchment, but actually an increase. Philanthropy and remittances were the most resilient in the face of some of the most significant economic, social, health shocks that we've experienced. So to summarize very quickly, in a time where we have, you could say, a large number of challenges that we have to contend with, we've seen that philanthropy and remittances have been the most resilient in response to these shocks. They've been counter-cyclical, more funding going to the African continent. And what all of these numbers should emphasize, and this slide shows the picture before COVID, is that if there is one thing that needs to be on all of our agendas, whether you're an investor, whether you're in philanthropy, whether you are someone who just cares about the continent, is how do we start to have the conversation about engaging the African diaspora, reducing the barriers to engagement, and truly unlocking the potential that lies there. So I'll stop here and turn it back over to Emma because I know we're out of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Una. Thank you so much for that. Let me go back to, thank you for that. It was, I think, very important for us to get the perspective, the data around, around what's happening so people can get a sense that, you know, that remittances continue to be extremely, extremely important for the African continent. So we recognize that, we see that, but now the question is what's next? And so what I want, what I'd like all of you to do is comment on the question of how now we see, you know, we see the remittances numbers, we see that they've been resilient, they've been growing. How do we get to a stage where we are converting these remittances into more sustainable philanthropy? And I think I used the term consumption smoothing earlier, which is the term that I saw that African Development Bank uses when they think about remittances. So again, those of us who are basically giving money to family members because they are in need, and all of us have done that in some way, shape, or form. So how do we now get to a stage, and how can we motivate the listeners on this in this webinar to really take those steps to move from the kind of giving that they're doing, which is important, absolutely important and relevant, but how do we motivate them to get to a stage where they're taking that next step and they are doing, their giving becomes much more sustainable. And it might be a journey that takes several years, but they are on that journey, getting them to a place where they are still able to do the consumption smoothing for family members because these things are important, but at the same time, they're able to give in a way that ultimately has longer term impact. However we might define the impact has longer term impact. So I'd like for each of you to just touch on that. What advice would you have for the listeners around how to go on that journey and stay on that journey? Because sometimes it can be a bit difficult given all of the demands that we have as professionals. Anybody can start. I think, Josh, why don't you start since I have you on the screen?
Yeah, why don't I start?
Yeah.
First of all, Una, it was great. I think you hit it right in the head, which is the one slide where you summarize that beyond remittances, I think remittances are going to continue to happen. And recently at the African Diaspora, we had a discussion in terms of whether you're trying to help your community, wherever it is in Africa, how you're sending money, and how's that money being used is to also encourage the governments to simplify the whole process. The 590 billion that you showed, by the way, 35 billion of that goes to the banks, and they're not African banks. They're actually Western banks that are just helping in that transfer. They take about 6 to 9%, which is, as most of you are probably aware, The UN is trying to cut it back down to about 3% was the UN development goal, but we're not even close to that. We're at about a little over 6%. I think the trade and investment piece, this is the most important piece because yes, you do remittances, but we haven't given people when they're sending their money other than to their family, pathways where they can invest in that community in a school system. They can invest in a water system and a healthcare system. Because I can tell you, I'll tell you a story about my parents. When they were in Eritrea, was a lot of their friends, which is either church related, whatever, they have orphanages that they've been running for kids during the war that lost their parents. They go to these orphanages and they live there. And every year they raise money. So when I go home for Christmas, this is what my dad does every single year. Not just, I have 3 brothers. By the way, Una, I went to Indiana and my parents live in Indianapolis. So there's a very large Eritrean community there. And all of them get together basically every Christmas. They would say, okay, we're going to raise money and send it to those orphanage schools. So that's how the schools are funded. And this is just a different way to do remittances. You're not just sending it to your family members because they do that anyway, but also collectively as a community, they're saying we need to continue to build on the school system. But it requires structure. I think it's easy for 1 or 2 people to continue to do that. And I think you'll see in the African diaspora, I wish I could invite all of you because I know our meeting is next week. There's a full day talking about specifically about the 3 things that you highlighted, which is remittances and beyond remittances. How do you actually create a platform that allows people to do these kinds of exchanges very easily? Trade and investment. Every year, we actually have something called Builders of Africa, where we identify 10 entrepreneurs across Africa. Pre-COVID, we actually used to bring them to Silicon Valley and they spent time with LinkedIn, Yahoo.com, like Yahoo, eBay, all of those different companies in Silicon Valley, just learning how they operate. So that as you're building your own enterprise, by the way, it could be a nonprofit, it could be for profit, it didn't matter, but we used to bring them, but we have Builders of Africa. By the way, if anybody that you know is doing something today in Africa and they're interested in that, the application process is open right now. So, and the idea is basically, if you get selected to join the Builders of Africa because of what you're doing, there's a guaranteed $25,000 at the end of your training that you get. And it might not sound a lot for some of us that are in the Western world, but it is a lot of money that goes a long way just to get you started. But as part of that program, then you get exposed to a lot of investors, to a lot of diasporans that actually become mentors to you. Or in some cases, I think as they mentor you, some people are willing to invest into those. But the most important piece I want to highlight is that network we talked about. This is something we're going to launch our new strategic plan for the African diaspora next week. As part of that, the biggest thing that we're pushing is actually creating this network of all Africans and what we call Friends of Africa that are interested in doing something, to be able to network, to be able to find the funding, to be able to partner actually to make sure that you're de-risking your money. If you even, the idea is to not limit all your investments just to be in your country of origin. If that's what you want to do, that's fine. But I think Africa has a much bigger power and a much bigger voice if we collectively look at it as Africa, and then underneath, it can go to a specific country or not. But there is an opportunity for us to show up as Africans and have that voice, which is much bigger than anything else that you will see. By the way, we had the Indian diaspora community come and talk to us. We had the Irish. By the way, the Irish, as small as they are, they're one of the most powerful network you will ever see in the diaspora. They have big control in terms of what they do in the US and how they actually push funding and tax incentives and other things with the government. So we've been talking to all of them, and they tend to help us quite a bit to understand what worked for them early on, and how do we actually take some of the best practices in those organizations to be able to leverage it. So I'll let the others comment. I'm sure other questions will come up.
And thank you, Josh. I appreciate that. And I would encourage you to just, make sure that, because this African Diaspora Network, I think, is quite relevant for a lot of us. So I think we'd like to know more about what they're doing, even if people can't necessarily join, but definitely come to conversations, and what are the deliberations about will be very, very useful. So please do share that. Aham, what's your advice to the aspiring philanthropist that really wants to take their giving to the next level in their community?
Sorry, I had to temporarily put my mic on mute. There's an announcement overhead. Very interesting discussion. I recognize we can go on forever. This is a passion of all of us. So I want to say good evening or good afternoon to Ona, who just joined, and a great talk about remittances. Just to quickly touch on that, the idea of remittances and the size. I read something recently where there's a $1 billion infrastructure gap. I'm sorry, $100 billion infrastructure gap in Africa, and the annual remittances are roughly 100 billion. So it clearly shows that with strategy, direction, and protocol, we can, through money that's transferred, close those gaps. And then the idea of the 6 to 9% going to non-African banks is also an area where collectively we can come together and solve that problem. This also touches on an organization I had mentioned earlier, which is the Business Integrated Network in the Diaspora by Associates. And I want to bring that up because in the discussion on remittances and also on trade and business opportunities in Africa, what we've recognized is that even with the Prosper Africa initiative, most of the businesses that benefit end up being non-African origin businesses. And so this is a network of African business owners who are multi-million-dollar businesses doing work, proven successful in the US, coming together to have that same impact on the continent. As far as advice to people who are looking to give remittances, I think that's what you asked, if I will capture that correctly. I'll say
how to get their giving to the next level, their remittances to now sustainable impact.
Yeah, right. I think there's so much to touch on, but one example that I saw recently was the Government College Umuahia Old Students Association that came together and transformed that school from what it was a few years ago to what it is now, which is closer to the experience that our own kids would go to. Not an experience that was not fit for that in the past. So I'll encourage people who are looking for ways to take their remittances to the next level to look for organizations, if they're in business, such as Bind, which I'm part of, or organizations that have identified a purposeful activity. Our nonprofit, for instance, is such an organization. There are political organizations doing that kind of work. And there are, I'm pretty confident, networks of individuals that need to connect. And so just having that mindset that we are trying to do things as a network to have a larger impact will serve all of us better.
Thank you. Jean, let's hear from you, and then we'll go to the participants for questions.
Yeah. When I think about it, anytime I think about transforming and changing anything Africa, I like to say that Africa is a person, not a place. In other words, when that individual changes, then everything changes. Now, I'd also like to, I saw a quote last week, and I'd like to share it with you, is that there are Africans around the world. Some of them are called Jamaicans. Some of them are called, the Africans are called Bahamians. They're called African Americans. It is time for us to consider inviting them to participate in the restructuring of Africa with us. And that's a way that you can optimize it on the individual level, because every single person who is in the diaspora has a network of people who, if invited and given a chance, will definitely join in. And literally the talent pool will expand even bigger, so that we are not just building on our own, we are building with others who have just never had an opportunity to join in. So looking at it from that perspective would probably even elevate in terms of not just, so that we just don't feel like it's daunting because we're doing it on our own, but actually looking at the time and the talent and the treasure of the other Africans who we sometimes leave out of this conversation.
Yeah,
That's
thank you for that. So thank you. And we oftentimes forget that, and that could be a whole another part of this conversation. And the work that we do with Wealth for Impact definitely thinks about the broader diaspora, because the issues they are also very, very similar, if not the same. So thank you for that. So unfortunately, many of you asked me to turn on the chat function. I actually had no idea how to do it, and I think I've just done it, but pardon me for that. So I think the chat function is on now. So if you want to do that, but please also put any questions you have. We have just a few more minutes left, so we'll just take a couple of questions. So if there's any burning question you have, please do put that in the chat, so that we can put that in the Q&A actually, so we can take a look at that. And then I'm just going to we're going to do a very quick poll, because we want to just get, part of what we do is just also to get information. So there are 3 questions that we just wanted you to answer. If you don't mind, you should see them in front of you right now. If you could answer these 3 questions for us. Hopefully you can see them on your screen, and then we'll just have a quick conversation about them. And then whoever else has questions, please just put a couple of them in the Q&A, and then we'll pose them. We really do want to understand the diaspora trends. Una gave a very a broad view of some of what's happening, some of the key trends, but those things are changing, and they're changing, and they're affected by a lot of what's happening. So the data is something that we have to keep updating again and again, because the situation is changing on the ground. So it's important for us to keep updating the data as we go along. So we just wanted to collect a few data points here to see what people's thoughts are on some of these things. This issue of remittances, I just wanted to make this comment here. It's so important that the World Bank actually tracks it on a quarterly basis and publishes a report about remittances. So they are taking it very seriously. I think beyond that, to what Jean has said and what Aham has said and what Josh has said, and from Una's presentation, it's very clear that in order to really move the needle, it has to be lots of people taking initiative for things that they're passionate about and pushing it to the next level. That's actually what's going to make the difference around how effective these remittances are, right? So the numbers are there, it's increasing and it's resilient, but how effective is it in terms of longer term impact? So, okay, I'm going to end this poll, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some of these responses in a second. So thank you for that. Let's see if any questions coming through. Ndidi, do you want to start with a question, and then I will see what comes through the...
Sure.
Yep.
Well, first of all, I want to echo Emma's comments and all the great comments that have been coming in. Well done to the panelists. Thank you for your inspiring work and sharing your inspiring journeys. Really, really encouraging and great food for thought for everyone listening to say, what can I do? And I'll challenge Jean, it's not a little bit. What seed can I sow that will become a catalyst for change? A quote that always inspired me, Jean, was one by JFK that said that if you throw in a little pebble, it becomes a wave, a ripple, and the ripple becomes a wave. A wave can throw down the mightiest wall of oppression, and that's what we need in many of our contexts. We need pebbles that become ripples, that become waves. And your work will transform, the education sector in Kenya, right? In rural Kenya, and hopefully will become a wave that will transform the education sector across rural Africa. Aham's investments will become that wave that transforms the healthcare landscape in Nigeria and obviously over across Africa. And similarly, with Josh, the investment capital, the community of practice, the innovation that can then start from Rwanda and serve as a catalyst. And that's what I believe we need is momentum, inspirational stories that then drive collective action. And we've heard it from you guys today. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm sure that if we were in a room, you'd get a resounding round of applause. There are a few questions that are coming in. I'll start with Chinwe's question. There's a new generation of young Africans in the diaspora who are passionate about Africa, but not tied to a particular country or familial obligation. I'd love to hear how you're thinking about motivating them to give. And I think this crosses with a few other questions around the next generation and people. And so it'd be great for the panelists to take that on if anyone wants to start with that question. I think it's a very important question. How do we get the next generation engaged? They don't feel connected to any country, but they want to give back. Josh, do you want to start with a response? How are you guys thinking about that?
1 second. Yeah, no, actually, it's interesting. I don't know how many people are familiar. There's actually a lot of very young Africans that are here in the US called the YELI program. There's the Nelson Mandela program that are coming to US to go to school to different universities. And we've been pulling every single one of them to actually help in this idea of philanthropy, this idea of volunteering your time, because that's the thing that we need to make sure people understand. In the US, a lot of times we define philanthropy, it's a billionaire just giving some of their money out to everybody, whatever they can, which is a great thing, nothing wrong with that. But I think also it's very important that we recognize it doesn't have to be always about dollars and cents that you give. It's the time, it's the knowledge, it's the human capital is as critical for Africa as everything else. And I think we're trying to basically work with a lot of this younger generation. But also, even when you look at our builders of Africa, it's a lot of young entrepreneurs that have just different ideas, different ways of addressing what they want to do for their community. But one thing we're seeing is there's also this Pan-African approach. It's interesting how many entrepreneurs I run into that are based in Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa. They would go, how do I connect with someone in Nairobi? How do I connect with someone in Addis to be able to take my idea to other countries? I think all of that network is going to continue a critical part of how we approach this. And I think platforms like the African Diaspora Network, we're looking to just scale that up quite a bit. By the way, one thing that's very important is I mentioned earlier that we still have the Ethiopian diaspora, the Nigerian diaspora, the Kenyan diaspora. We're actually looking to bring all of them, not to take away what they're doing, but also we want to give them a higher voice, especially when you're dealing with different governments, with different organizations, by allowing them to be part of the African Diaspora Network so that they have a slightly different voice, because now the Kenyan diasporans and the Ethiopian diasporans and the Nigerians could actually come together and talk to a US government, an African government, and say, we need this, or to the African Union. It's a very different discussion when you have that kind of power and when they realize the numbers of the human capital plus the financial ability to bring this is significant. So I think that's how we're approaching it, but it's going to be very important that we collectively bring all the voices of Africans, regardless of what country they come from, into a single voice so that they have much higher power.
Fantastic. Aham, can you take this issue on around sustainability? And then the other question that Rita has raised, which is diaspora just first generation? And I think we're seeing second and third generation even more involved than first generation. So Aham, if you take those two on, but quickly because we have limited amounts of time. Thank you.
Sure, super quick. Also talking about the Pan-African perspective, I think that's one of the advantages of being in the diaspora, because you have that bird's eye view that lets you see similarities with each other and build connections with each other more so than you do when you come from your native country. So I think that's a natural way of thinking. It's a Pan-African model. Recently went on a trade mission to Italy and getting ready for one to Singapore, and it just struck me, why can't we have such trade missions to other parts of Africa? And that's sort of what we're building with Bind Associates. In terms of sustainability, it's absolute. I think we have intentionally designed the work that we're doing with the healthcare platform to the point now where I'm hardly Nigerian now, and we found talent that can do some of the same things that we used to travel back and forth to do. And so all new initiatives that we are undertaking, be it in terms of remittances, in terms of teaching, in terms of surgery, IT platforms, and now with the business associate network that I recently mentioned, it's all designed to be such that we set the foundation that others can come and tap into and allow it to go further than we ourselves can carry it. So I think that's without any doubt, a superior way of thinking. As far as definitions, I think it's always going to be controversial. Second generation Africans, the better the continent is doing, the more they resonate with it. If you look at other examples, it's very easy to find a second or third Jamaican claim that they're Jamaican, but you hardly find Haitians claiming that they're Haitian. And I think that part of that has to do with their pride in where they come from. To me, I think we could use each other. Many of the second generation Africans now outnumber the first generation Africans by far, at least with my experience in the United States. And so I think they themselves identify as Africans, especially when the continent is doing well, perhaps in a compartmentalized way with music, with movies, with sports, not as much so in some other areas. Nevertheless, I think we all share the same struggle. We all have the same difficulties when the continent is underperforming, and the same benefits when it's performing. So to me, I think those who themselves identify as diaspora, be them second generation, are welcome. When you start getting to third and fourth, I'm not sure. But for now, I think there's a lot of second generation people that easily fit the description.
Fantastic. And Jean, can you take one of the questions? There are many more questions coming in around sustainability, around trade, and around broadening the definitions.
Yeah, I think I know there are a lot of questions, but I was just thinking, as I was thinking about what my answer would be, is challenging ourselves to take it back to the home. The home is where this conversation begins when we're talking about sustaining anything that we build for Africa. If we're not having these conversations as part of our holidays when we gather, and we're not having these conversations, and really not to bring down Thanksgiving or to make it so serious, but there are ways that we can break down these conversations so that a teenager who's hearing us laughing and talking about our culture and way back when and what happened feels the need to get involved simply because it has been introduced to them by someone they love and trust in a position of fun. I just feel like we could talk at the highest level possible, and I love it because I love the data, something that is not my strong suite. But I know for a fact that everybody can speak about this at some level at home and start introducing it to the generations to come.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. We can't answer all the questions. I'd encourage the panelists to please go in and type responses to the questions that have been posed directly to you. But I want to say, coming out of this, just a few words, and then I'll pass it on to Emma to close us out. I think for me, there's a real sense of urgency that we work collaboratively to invest in strategic philanthropy and giving in collaboration with each other. Here today, we've seen examples and heard examples of interventions that are working and are making a difference. And the call that I'm giving you, Emma is giving you today, is to think about what makes you angry about your ecosystem and what you can do about it. I'm so encouraged by the second and third generation diasporans, our children and grandchildren, who are making that difference. In fact, some of the best and most dynamic innovators in Nigeria right now are kids who were born in the US, who lived in the US their whole lives, who have come back to make a difference in their parents' country, really. And it just gives me so much joy. And I think they have the fire, they have the desire, and we have to channel their energies towards giving. I also think there's something to be said for the collective action. And that's why at Wealth for Impact, we want support some of you who have an interest in doing this systematically and strategically with others on the continent. And we provide a lot of advisory support and engagement and can hold your hand through the process. So do please reach out and let's see how we can work together to really ensure that it's beyond a bag of rice for Christmas. It's beyond a bag of clothes for Christmas, old books to the village, but that we're really thinking about generational impact and generational wealth. I think of how the Ukrainians have fought for Ukraine during this time and how much money has been poured into Ukraine. I think about what's happening in Israel and the support and the lobby on both sides of the divide. And I wonder how many of us are collectively taking action for our regions. In my new role at the One Campaign, I'm going to be reaching out to many of you to think about how we can do this more systematically. But I think through Wealth for Impact, we are on the ground also to help you on that journey. So thanks again, and hand over now to Emma.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll just really inspiring conversation, certainly inspiring me. Just quickly on some of the feedback, just so that we're on the same page around data. In terms of the most expensive country to send money from, most of you said it's the US. Actually, of those 4 countries listed, Canada, France, UK, and the US is actually the last of the 4. The most expensive is France. So it's important for us to track some of this data because, again, there is a lot going on to really try and get the cost of remittances down. There's a target that by 2030, that the average cost of remittances should be less than 3% globally. And so lots of development agencies are really focused on making this happen because this is going to inspire more people to give. In terms of, the cost to send remittances from sub-Saharan Africa to the rest of the world, Africa is about 7%, right? 7%, that's the average cost of sending about $200. And then South Asia, of all the regions, South Asia is less than 5%. That I think probably many of you would have guessed, that there's a lot of technology there, a lot of innovation, and so they've been able to bring down the cost quite a bit. So again, we see the opportunity for Africa, especially as we're leapfrogging in technology to get to those levels. And then also around where people are giving, education, healthcare, food security, all these areas are the ones where people feel very strongly. And I think we assumed that was going to be the case. But again, all of us are also facing the need to really help people in a short-term basis around emergencies. So what also inspires me is a lot of the comments or questions really are people actually already have ideas. They're already doing things. They want to reach out to some of the panelists here. I encourage all of you to reach out to them via LinkedIn. If you want personal connections, just make sure you put it in the chat. I'll review them and then we'll send them off to them and they can hopefully make a bilateral connection. So I'm really encouraged by that people they already have ideas, right? They already know what they want to do and perhaps want to partner. So that's extremely encouraging. It means that these are people who are already on the path. And for me, I would say my biggest takeaway, Gina, I love what you said about making sure that we're talking about this with our young people, right? This is not just a conversation for people of a certain age. We really need to bring them along. And I would offer up that they can have amazing ideas and thoughts around what we could do differently. They might challenge us in ways that we did not expect. And so maybe a challenge for us at Wealth for Impact is to make sure that we have somebody representing Gen Alpha or Gen Z on these webinars so that they can provide a perspective so that we can start to challenge our thinking, because I think they're going to offer up. I mean, we already know Africa is the youngest continent, that their perspectives are really going to drive change across the board. So thank you so much. This is, again, a series of conversations. For us, this diaspora conversation was really, really important. We're going to continue this going forward. And again, what we hope to have happen is that many of you will take that next step, whatever it is for you, to start formalizing your giving in such a way that in 5 years, when you look back, you can really say that you've made a difference in the community or the issue that you care most about. And there is potential to do that. And what we're going to be doing at Wealth for Impact is really providing you some of the resources and tools to be able to make that journey for yourself, and get to a place where you can feel comfortable saying that you've been able to make a sustainable impact in whatever area you're working in. So thank you very much, Jean. Thank you, Aham. Thank you, Josh. Thank you to Una. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your passion, because without that, this conversation wouldn't be so exciting. I'm personally very fired up about what we can do. So thank you very much, and keep fighting the good fight. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Have a great day,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Okay.
Thank you. Have a good day.